Yousuf Karsh found himself in the chamber of the Speaker of the House of Commons in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. He had set up his lights and camera already the night before. He checked his exposure and camera settings again as he waited patiently for the speech to Parliament to end. Karsh was confident with himself. After all, he had been invited by the Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie King himself. But he went over in his head the details of what he had learned of Winston Churchill. The speech had ended, and now it was time. The Prime Minister entered the room arm in arm with Churchill and followed by his entourage. Karsh switched on his floodlights, instantly capturing Churchill's attention. "What's this? What's this?" he asked. The time was ticking as Karsh only had 2 minutes with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. This very well was the most important portrait he would take thus far in his career. And it was a career he had not originally chosen. Photographer was a far cry from his original desire of becoming a doctor once he had immigrated to Canada. Having escaped with his family from Armenia, suffering from persecution and deprivation, he had joined up with his uncle who taught him the ropes of becoming a photographer. And now here he was, in the presence of both the Prime Minister of Canada and the United Kingdom, and Churchill didn't look particularly happy. After all, it had only been a few weeks since the bombing of Pearl Harbor and America had just entered the war. Churchill was in Ottawa after making a trip to Washington, giving a speech to rally the troops and thanking them for continued efforts. Knowing now that the Americans had entered the conflict, the war could be won. Karsh was interested in capturing someone fighting against a tyranny he was all too familiar with from his own past. With the light now on, Karsh stepped forward and said, "Sir, I hope I will be fortunate enough to make a portrait worthy of this historic occasion." Churchill looked around and asked why he had not been told about this. His entourage began to laugh, making the already awkward scene even more uneasy. To make matters worse, Churchill took out a cigar and lit up. As Churchill puffed away on his fresh cigar, he relented, saying, "You may take one." The cigar created a problem, though. Karsh had arranged the scene to complement his own style of dramatic lighting. Smoke rising from the cigar would interfere with the shot and certainly cause a problem having such a limited amount of time and, if he was serious, only one shot. Karsh approached Churchill and presented him with an ashtray, asking him to discard the cigar for the shot. But Churchill ignored the request, chomped and puffed away. Karsh nodded and went back to his camera and again made sure that everything was technically correct. He looked back at Churchill and waited. The Prime Minister continued to vigorously chomp on his cigar, so Karsh waited for a tad longer. Finally, Karsh approached Churchill without premeditation and respectfully said, "Forgive me, sir," and plucked the cigar out of his mouth. By the time he got back to his camera, Churchill looked belligerent and miffed. It was precisely the look Karsh wanted for the portrayal of a man going up against Nazi Germany. He commented on how the Prime Minister looked like he wanted to devour him. It was in that instant that he took the photograph. By plucking the cigar from Churchill's mouth without permission, Karsh was able to create and capture the now famous portrait. His expression the direct result of being annoyed by the photographer. It was said that Churchill exclaimed, "You can even make a roaring lion stand still to be photographed," and that's just how Karsh titled the photo, "The Roaring Lion." The photo brought Karsh his first international fame. He went on to photograph some of the world's most prominent personalities, including royalty, statesmen, artists, and writers. Karsh's style utilized carefully arranged lights to meticulously model his subjects' faces, obtaining an idyllic presentation that aided in promoting their public image. The Roaring Lion appeared on the cover of Life magazine in the May issue of 1945. He is quoted as saying, "My portrait of Winston Churchill changed my life. I knew after I had taken it that it was an important picture, but I could hardly have dreamed that it would become one of the most widely reproduced images in the history of photography." In fact, over 20 photos by Karsh would appear as a cover for Life magazine until he retired in 1992. It ended up being one of the most famous portraits ever taken, and even appeared on England's £5 note. which is why it was most recently the subject of a highly publicized art heist. An original signed portrait of the Roaring Lion had been placed inside a landmark hotel in Ottawa, mounted in the Chateau Laurier's reading room for decades. That was until an employee at the hotel noticed that the frame containing their prized print did not match the other frames on the wall. The hotel called Jerry Fielder, director of Karsh's estate, who requested a photo of the signature. Having seen the signature for 43 years, it only took him a second to realize what he was looking at was a fake. According to hotel officials, they estimated that the print had been stolen 8 months prior to anyone realizing it and suspect that it was an inside job. The Fairmont Chateau Laurier wasn't just any hotel. Yousuf Karsh held his first exhibition there in 1936. He eventually opened his photography studio there in 1972. In 1980, he and his wife had moved in. Then, before his death in 2002, Karsh had gifted a number of his signed original prints, including the Churchill portrait, to the hotel. The hotel estimates the heist took place sometime between December 25, 2021 and January 6, 2022. They're asking for anyone with images of the photograph taken around that time to send them in. Karsh had closed his studio in 1992, and his negatives went to the Library and Archives Canada, and no copies were allowed. In 2020, a couple of years before the art heist, another signed copy of the Roaring Lion original print had sold for $62,500 at Sotheby's auction.